Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely, let's do it.
All right, today we're tackling a really pivotal period, the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And specifically, we're looking at this podcast episode, The Limits of Nonviolence in the Civil Rights Movement. It really gets you thinking, you know?
It really does, yeah.
I mean, we all know about the big wins, the Civil Rights Act, all that. But then 1967 hits, some of the most violent riots in U.S. history. And it's all part of this same fight for equality. It's kind of wild when you think about it.
It's true. There's this whole other side to the story we don't always hear about.
Right. So we're going to dig into that, those tensions within the movement, why some folks felt like, well, nonviolence wasn't getting the job done.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Totally. So to set the stage, right, early to mid-60s, huge legal changes happening. You got the Civil Rights Act of 64, then bam, Voting Rights Act the year after.
Huge. I mean, these weren't just like words on paper, right? This was dismantling decades, generations of segregation that was literally written into law. Think about it. The Civil Rights Act, it outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, even national origin.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, equal access to public places, jobs, it turned the world upside down.
And then the Voting Rights Act. I mean, that's like the heart of a democracy, isn't it? Being able to vote, to actually have your say.
Exactly. Literacy tests, poll taxes, all those ways they kept Black people from voting, gone, just like that. The Voting Rights Act was about giving power back to the people through representation, something that had been denied for, well, forever, basically.
It's almost impossible to imagine how big those changes must felt at the time. But, and this is where our podcast episode takes this interesting turn, it wasn't all celebrations. For a lot of Black Americans, especially up north in the city, there was this gap, like the laws changed, but life didn't change that fast.
That's the thing, and the episode points this out. The North, it was different from the South. It wasn't about these obvious, in-your-face racist laws anymore. It was more like this sneaky, built-in racism. Like it was woven into the city itself, you know?
So less about changing specific laws, more about like unweaving the whole system.
Exactly. And they use Newark and Detroit as examples. Even with these new laws from the federal government, they were still dealing with massive economic inequalities. Police brutality was everywhere, segregation and housing, schools. It was like nothing had changed.
So it's like, yeah, these legal wins, they were essential, don't get me wrong, but it's like step one in a marathon.
Yeah.
And that gap between the law and how people were actually living, that's where the whole nonviolence question gets really interesting, right? That's where things get complicated.
Absolutely, because it wasn't just theory anymore. It was about real life and people's patience. It was wearing thin. It's like all that frustration was building and building, and then boom, summer of 67 hits, and it's like someone lit a match.
Yeah, and not just like protests. We're talking full-on riots in cities across the country.
Exactly. And the podcast, it does this amazing job of putting you right there in the chaos. Like Newark, for example, it starts with this Black taxi driver who gets arrested.
Which, sadly, feels like something that could still happen today, right?
Right, exactly. But back then, this arrest, it was like the last straw. Days of riots, and by the time it's over, 26 people are dead, most of them Black residents. Just caught in the crossfire. It's heartbreaking, really.
And then Detroit, that was even worse, right?
So much worse. The podcast, they talk about entire city blocks just gone. Wiped down the violence. They had to call in the National Guard. It took weeks to get things even remotely under control.
It really makes you realize this wasn't just a few isolated things happening. This was like a nationwide wave of anger breaking out.
Exactly. And that's the whole point the podcast makes. You know, these riots, it wasn't just about what happened that day, that week, whatever sparked it. It was everything. Generations of oppression, of broken promises. It all built up to this explosion of enough is enough, like nonviolence. It wasn't working fast enough, you know?
It really makes you think, right? If the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, all of that, if those huge legal victories weren't enough to stop this from happening, what was missing?
Yeah.
Was the whole idea of nonviolence flawed somehow?
And that's where things get really interesting, because even within the civil rights movement itself, there were people saying exactly that. By 67, you've got these really vocal critics, people who were part of the movement, but they're saying, wait a minute, this isn't working. And one of the loudest voices, Stokely Carmichael.
Right, Carmichael. He was a leader in SNCC,
Right.
And he's the one who really brought this term, Black Power, into the conversation.
Exactly. And it's important to remember Black power, it wasn't just a slogan, some catchy phrase. This was a fundamental challenge to the whole idea of integration, which up until then was like the core belief of the movement. Dr. King, that was his whole thing.
So if integration was about, like, appealing to white America's sense of right and wrong, what was Black Power saying? What was their approach?
It was about Black people taking control, building their own power economically, politically, not waiting for white people to give them anything anymore. And the podcast actually quotes Carmichael here. He says, quote, "We have to stop begging white people for what's rightfully ours. We have to take it." Powerful stuff.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely a different message than what we usually hear about the civil rights movement. It's not about asking nicely anymore. It's about demanding what you deserve.
Right. And for a lot of people, especially those who felt like the pace of change was just way too slow, that nonviolence wasn't actually changing their lives in any real way, Black Power spoke to them. It resonated.
It sounds like a total shift in mindset.
It was. And of course, like anything else, Black Power meant different things to different people. The episode points out, even within the movement, people were arguing about what it looked like in practice. Some folks, it was about self-defense, like we've got to protect ourselves from violence because clearly no one else is going to do it. Others, it was about economics, building Black-owned businesses, that kind of thing. And for some, it was about really embracing Black identity, Black culture, in a way that was like a direct challenge to white supremacy. But no matter how you interpret it, Black Power was this growing sense of we're done waiting, we need change, and we need it now.
So where does that leave us? It's like this puzzle, right? Yeah, this undeniable progress with nonviolence, these hard-fought legal victories, but then right alongside it, this whole other energy saying, hold on, that's not enough, we need power, we need it yesterday. It really makes you wonder, what was the legacy of each side? What really created change?
It's the question, isn't it? And the podcast makes a really interesting point. This isn't just history. This debate is still going on today. How do we create real, lasting change? Is it about appealing to people's better nature? Or is it about forcing the system to change? It's something we're still grappling with.
And I got to imagine these two ideas, these two approaches, it's not like one's right and one's wrong, right? They can work together, maybe. I don't know, did the podcast talk about how those threads, the nonviolence and the Black Power, if they influenced each other at all?
They did, and it's actually a really important point. The podcast argues that even though Black Power felt to some people like a rejection of everything Dr. King was about, it also forced the movement to evolve. Economic inequality, self-determination, those issues, they became central to King's message, too, in those later years. It's like these two things, these two seemingly opposite ideas, they were pushing on each other, reshaping the whole conversation.
That's fascinating. Like each side was holding up a mirror, right? Showing the other what they were missing, what still needed work, even when they were both fighting for the same goal in the end.
Exactly. And they made this point that stuck with me. This tension, this back and forth within movements for justice, it's not unique to the 60s. It happens over and over again throughout history, like a reminder that progress, it's not a straight line, it's messy, it's full of detours and disagreements, but the work, it never really stops.
It makes you think about everything happening today, Black Lives Matter, all of that. Those same arguments about how direct action should look, how fast change should happen, they're more relevant than ever.
Completely. And the podcast even draws a connection between the calls for economic power back in the civil rights era and what we're seeing now with the racial wealth gap, or how back then they wanted community control of the police. And now it's all about police reform. It's like we're seeing those echoes of 67 all over again.
Which I think is what makes this whole conversation so important. It's not just about understanding the past, it's about seeing the patterns, the complexities of how change actually happens. Because those patterns, they're still playing out today.
I couldn't agree more. If there's one thing to take away from this whole deep dive, and the podcast really drives this home, it's that the fight for equality, it's a marathon, not a sprint. There will be victories, there will be setbacks, moments of unity, moments of disagreement, but the work continues.
It does indeed. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the limits of nonviolence in the civil rights movement. We covered a lot of ground, landmark legislation, the upheaval of 67, the debates within the movement itself. But I think, most importantly, we connected those historical events to the conversations we're still having today about equality, about justice. Hopefully this gave you a lot to think about. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.